What if ADHD is not actually ADHD, and how we have come to contextualize it, right? We call ADHD a Ritalin deficiency, a dopamine deficiency. It's a lack of attention, right? Attention deficit. And then we either say, oh, the child is a little impulsive or a little hyperactive. Except we never really ask why this ADHD is taking place in a child or adult, right? And then when you step back and you look at the fact that a large percentage of these kids also have sensory findings, right? Clothing is a little too itchy, hair washing bothers them, places that are too loud sometimes get overwhelming. And then you also add to that processing errors, right? A lot of kids who have ADHD have difficulty learning math. They have sometimes difficulty reading. They have poor memory. They have processing issues where their mind is not sharp. So it's not just they have trouble focusing. It's not just that they are hyperactive. It's not just that they are inattentive. When you zoom out, you all of a sudden start realizing there is a clustering of other things that happen for a lot of these kids, especially those kids with more severe forms of ADHD. And I'm not talking about the kid that's a little inattentive and you give them 5 milligrams of Ritalin and everything is perfect. And this is also not to bash the use of medications, because I think medications could be helpful for some children and can work miracles. The whole purpose of this conversation is to ask questions of why the heck are these things happening? And how is it that we have come to label this thing as ADHD when you step back and you look and you say, well, if it's just ADHD, why are these cognitive processing issues taking place? And what are these sensory issues about? And then you zoom out, a lot of kids with ADHD also have some allergies and digestive issues and so forth and so on, right? As a pediatrician, the one thing that I have been really blessed to have is the ability to actually see some kids, go over time. So I have my consultations to families that come to see me because their child has some really significant issues. And, the poor child is about to fail out of school because they can't focus, they can't process, they can't learn. They call themselves awful, awful things like I am stupid. They call themselves awful, awful things like I am dumb. And I've lost count of how many kids have labeled themselves as that in front of me. But I also have kids that are born into my practice, and I get to see them over time. And I get to watch over them over time. And I see how they evolve. And for those of you who have kids with ADHD, more severe forms of ADHD, where they also have some learning difficulties, if you want to say learning disabilities, I want you all to stand back and look at their progress, because the problem with our current approach is child is fine. Oh, there's no problem, preschool. Oh, there's no problem. Your kindergartner is a little hyperactive, but all kindergartners are a little hyperactive, especially little boys, right? First grade, still not a problem because our expectations are pretty low. That same child that was in preschool, that was in kindergarten, that was in first grade, is now in third grade. And now suddenly your kid has ADHD. You need to put him on Adderall or Ritalin or whatever because they're becoming a problem. And then by third or fourth grade, that same child is now starting to contextualize themselves as these awful things because they can't focus, they can't learn, they can't process. They see all their friends learning math, learning whatever language, whatever academic thing easily, right? Except they can't. And they're aware of it, so they start giving up. And then by the time they're through middle school or high school, they've already really come to believe that they are those awful things. And so they give up. And that is also why the rates of children with ADHD not making it to college is 2 to 3-fold kids who don't have ADHD. Rates of incarceration, I hope that as a parent, no person ever has to see that happen to their child. Rates of incarceration are 300-fold. Why? Because these kids give up. These kids give up. You can't focus, you can't learn, you can't process. So what do? Well, I'm just dumb, I'm just stupid, I'm just bad, I'm fill in the blank. So why the hell are these things happening? And is a dopamine insufficiency enough to explain all of these things? How does dopamine affect sensory pathways, right? How does dopamine affect processing, learning math? And, you know, when you look at our definition of ADHD, when was this formed? 30 years ago? 40 years ago? And we haven't updated it, have we? We haven't reanalyzed, like, is ADHD truly just this? Or is it more? And I believe it's more. I believe it's a hell of a lot more. And here's one of the fundamental things that happens. There's a tipping point where a given environmental toxin, it could be glyphosate. So for those of you that are living in the farming belt of this country where glyphosates are just sprayed like water, it could be those of you who live in parts of the country where heavy metals are just rampant. And I'm not talking a tiny bit of heavy metal in a vaccine. I'm talking like lead pipes that are just leaching lead into your water and you are not able to filter it. I'm talking about mold. And sadly, a quarter of you have been exposed to mold. I'm talking people that live in cities or industrial areas where air pollution and environmental pollution is just through the roof. It turns out that any heavy load of a toxin, and obviously you know my bias, which is mold, but any heavy toxin, really large loads, not a tiny bit of glyphosate in the one non-organic food you gave your kid. I'm talking heavy loads. Do something really weird to the gastrointestinal tract. They basically degrade the gastrointestinal tract. They cause leaky gut, intestinal permeability, but it's not just intestinal permeability. They actually cause an inflammatory response in the gastrointestinal tract. They activate these cells called mast cells, and that's just the tip of the iceberg because then there are dendritic cells, there are a cascade of other cells, there are T cells sitting in the gut, but they cause gut immune activation because now the leaky gut has happened, so the intestinal permeability is compromised, and now the immune cells that are sitting there, it's like the National Guard is sitting at the fence, except now the fence is torn up, and whatever awful thing is on the other side, the National Guard is now like, oh, we've got to attack because the bad thing that is on the other side of the fence cannot get into our world, which is what the immune system does. Because if it doesn't, guess what happens? We die. If the contents of our intestines enter our body, we die. It's called sepsis. Now, there's something else that also happens. It's not just the immune activation. The contents of our intestines are meant to stay in our intestines, right? Food proteins are supposed to stay in our intestines, and the nutrients from those foods, the amino acids, the building blocks are supposed to come in, the healthy fats, right? Proteins, those things are supposed to come in. Everything else is supposed to stay inside the intestines. What happens when that doesn't happen? What happens when all kinds of things, not just food proteins, but all kinds of compounds, toxins from the gut enter into our bloodstream? There's a really fascinating article that was published on COVID and how COVID disrupts the gastrointestinal tract and these harmful substances. And one of these harmful substances is bacterial endotoxins. These are toxins that bacteria produce from just normal functioning that ends up getting into the bloodstream and gets in here. Because these bacterial endotoxins just cross the blood-brain barrier like it's nothing. It's a walk in the park for them. And for those of you that are curious, do a search for LPS, lipopolysaccharides, which are the bacterial endotoxins, and just type in LPS in Alzheimer's, LPS in dementia, LPS and autism, LPS, and just do your own search. And you will be terrified by what you find, because what you will find is that these bacterial endotoxins, and I'm pretty sure that these bacterial endotoxins are just the tip of the iceberg of the other things that come into our bloodstream and come into this. But these toxins, on top of the environmental toxins that created the mess in the first place, create a milieu that is basically like having toxic sludge in your brain. And that toxic sludge happens to be highly neurotoxic, which means it is toxic to our brain cells. It can damage the mitochondria. So the mitochondria, the energy generators of our brain, basically don't work as efficiently. And guess what that creates? For those of you who have had COVID, and I mean, at this point, we've all had COVID. Imagine that more severe form of COVID or the flu, where your brain was just sludge, right? You just could not think for the life of you. Think about that. Think about the time when your memory was shot to hell because your brain fog was so severe, you literally couldn't remember anything. All you wanted to do was just lie there, right? You couldn't think, you didn't feel good. You couldn't remember a whole lot. You couldn't, forget about processing, right? Try doing any kind of complex new task in that moment of brain fog, intense brain fog. And that brain fog is just the tip of the iceberg of what happens. Because when you have neuronal inflammation, you have neuronal toxicity, brain cell toxicity, and then on top of that, you have the mitochondria are starting to falter, and the mitochondria are basically essential for every part of our brain cell functioning, right? Imagine like all the little signals that go back and forth, all the communication that has to take place in our brain for processing and information assimilation to happen. How does that happen? How does it happen if there's lack of energy? It's like trying to run a factory, except the electricity is shot and like half the machines in the factory work. How would you be able to get things to happen? But it's more than that. It's not just that the brain cells are faltering. It's not just that there is brain fog. It turns out that when the immune system becomes activated, right? Because we said there's the leaky gut, and now the immune cells, right? The National Guard is like, holy cow, we've got to attack because if we don't, we're going to die. Now you get activation of these immune cells, particularly these mast cells. They're one of the sentinels. They're one of the primary scout guards of the gut. These mast cells become activated. And these mast cells start dumping out all kinds of signals to say, hey, there's funky stuff happening. One of the signals that they release is histamine. It turns out that histamine causes very odd changes to the nervous system. On top of just causing the nervous system to be wired, and when you look at the children who have ADHD, there are some who are sluggish because they're just exhausted. And that's the mitochondria, their energy production being shot. The other thing that happens, though, is that they just can't slow down, right? Their mind is racing 1,000 miles an hour. They can't sleep. They can't slow down. At the same time, they can't focus, right? They're frazzled, they're hyper, but they can't focus. There's another thing that histamine does. And if any of you are curious, type in HAAS, HOS, histamine and nervous system. And it's a 45-page, 50-page beast of an article that is amazing. And Dr. Haas basically goes through every step of what histamine does to the nervous system. And one of the things that Dr. Haas talks about, which is significantly underappreciated in the conversations around ADHD, is actually how histamine modulates our sensory pathways. And now, in treating thousands of kids, one of the things that I have seen is every time there is some kind of significant sensory distortion. I'm not talking about the kid that's like, Mommy, this tag bothers me, but everything else is fabulous. I'm talking about the kids that have trouble wearing certain clothes. They have trouble socializing in birthday parties or loud, crowded environments because the world is too loud. There are some of you adults that this applies to. And these same kids, guess what happens when you have sensory distortions? You also become hyperactive depending on your constitution. So those kids that cannot sit still, you know what this hyperactivity is about? It's not a dopamine deficiency. I mean, when you give Ritalin, it slows down. You know why? Because you basically bulldoze such high amounts of dopamine into the brain where any person with whatever issue can now focus and for the most part sit still. But dopamine deficiency is not where hyperactivity comes from. Hyperactivity is actually a vestibular issue. It's a balance center distortion. So these kids that are doing this all the time, they actually have a sensory pathway distortion in their balance centers. But when you zoom out, it's not just a hyperactivity thing that they have, is it? A lot of these kids also are sensitive to loud and crowded environments. And one of the things that also happens when you get sound processing distortions is when you're in a classroom and there are 25 other kids who half of whom are making some kind of noise, there's a clock ticking, there's whatever other stimulus. Guess what's not happening? That child is not paying attention to the teacher. You know why? Because that child's brain is trying to pay attention to everything at the same time. The simple test that I have families do to look at this is I tell them, take your kid, put them in a really quiet environment where it's just you and them, and give them a 5 to 7 step command. I want you to do blah, 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 and then have them repeat it to you. See how well they catch it. Now, go into a loud and crowded environment, lots of chaos, and do exactly the same thing and see what happens. And you know what parents tell me when they do that? They're like, she got like 2 of the 3 commands when there was a lot and understood everything when it was just one-on-one. And a lot of parents say, well, my kid seems to learn so well when they're with their tutor and it's dead quiet. But I don't understand why they can't learn in the classroom. Why? Because their brain can't handle all the processing information. Their brain can't focus on one thing because their brain's perception of all this information is essentially, it's like not having a filter and everything is coming in at the same time, which causes the brain to glitch. But it's not just that either. I wish that was it. Guess what else inflammation does to the nervous system? It trips up all kinds of other pathways. So it's not just you get sensory distortions. It's not just you get mitochondrial issues. It's not just you get toxicity in the brain. You also get distortions in other areas, such as the microglia. So the microglia, the glia, are the primary immune cells of the brain. And guess what also gets activated when this entire mess of a cascade unfolds? The microglia wake up and they're like, what's going on? What's going on? Where's the war? What's happening? So now they're on guard. Do a search for microglia and impulsivity. And what you find is on top of impulsivity, a whole cascade of or host of other diseases show up that are related to microglial activation. And this is just the tip of the iceberg of what takes place. You get a host of weird food sensitivities because all the food proteins are now leaking through and now they are causing a problem. So for all of you who have kids who have ADHD, a host of processing issues, and they happen to be sensitive to a whole bunch of foods, or some of you adults, right? And you step back and you're like, wow, this laundry list of issues seems to have no end. It's not just ADHD. And the problem is that you can't identify pretty much any of this on conventional labs, right? So you go to your doctor and well-intending, loving pediatrician who adores your kid, you know, you're like, I'm really worried about my kid. Okay, let's do some blood work. So what do? They do a blood count, a CBC with differential. They do a complete metabolic panel. They check liver function. They maybe check your kid's thyroid, maybe check vitamin D, maybe check iron, and they're like, everything looks fine. And for those of you that have had blood work for your kids, The one thing that I would have you go and look at is, first of all, weird little things. Like, is your kid's white blood cell count a little low? Because normal blood cell counts are somewhere around 4,200 to 4,500. So if your kid was just right at that age, maybe a little below. Or if you look specifically at the eosinophils, which are the allergy-mediating cells, sometimes they're a little high. Normal eosinophil count is like 1.5% to 2%. If your kid was at 4% or 6% or 10%, there's something there. Sometimes we find liver enzymes are slightly elevated. And the reason why pediatricians don't pay attention to this is, heavens forbid, cancer is a WBC count of 2 or 1, which is 1,000 or 2,000. Or a liver enzyme, if you're worried about liver damage. So pediatricians are taught to pay attention when liver enzymes go above 300. So when normal is 35 and your kid's liver is at 50, pediatricians don't pay attention to that because they're like, well, it's not liver damage, so I don't know what it is, but everything is fine, right? And then you get other things like some zinc deficiency if you ever check RBC zinc, not serum zinc, because serum zinc doesn't tell you anything about what's actually happening. Or some iron deficiency. Oh, your kid just has iron deficiency. Give him some iron, everything will be fine. Why? Well, if you have a gastrointestinal tract that's totally off, guess what happens? First of all, minerals don't absorb. So zinc and iron do not get very well absorbed into the bloodstream. And for those of you parents, moms, whose iron has tanked and you don't know why, but you also have brain fog, you also feel really off, it's not just you need more iron. It's you need to ask, what the heck is going on in my gastrointestinal tract? And this is not to raise alarm. It's not to say, oh my God, this is doom and gloom. This is awful. This is for us to start having conversations of maybe it's time for us to update our understanding around ADHD. And when you look at certain things like the gastrointestinal tract and how we assess it, what do most holistic, now let's step out of the conventional pediatric world and look at the functional medicine world. How do most conventional or functional medicine doctors assess the gut? A poop test. Except, what does that poop test actually tell us? The poop test tells us that in the distal colon, right, the end of our colon, it'll give you a picture of what is in the end of the colon. So we get really dialed in, oh my God, there's too much of this bacteria and too little of this bacteria, so therefore we need to do this probiotic to fix it. Does it give any picture of the rest of the bowels? Does it actually give you a picture of your small intestines? No, absolutely not. The reason why, frankly speaking, I've pretty much stopped using stool testing outside of checking for parasites. I think checking for parasites is important, but outside of that, I've stopped doing stool testing is because I realized it was giving no picture of the rest of the gut. One of the tests that has some value is a urine organic acid test. And the two companies that I particularly like are Genova Diagnostics and Mosaic, which used to be Great Plains. And sometimes, now their failure rate is still about 30%. So 30 to 40% of the time, there's all kinds of weird things happening and the test looks totally normal or very normal. But when you do an organic acid test, sometimes if someone knows how to read it, you start getting funky markers of like the bacteria are off, and you have oxalates, which are typically a sign of a fungal imbalance. You get signs that things are going on. But I'm sharing this because we rely so heavily on these diagnostic tools to tell us like, oh, everything is fine, your stool looks great, or oh, you've got an imbalance in bifidobacters or Akkermansia or whatever. And we blindly follow these tests, presuming they tell us everything there is, without actually looking at the total physiology that's happening. So what can you do if you or your child is in this boat? The first thing is to ask, what caused this mess of a picture to begin with? If you have suspected heavy metals, go find someone that can check your kid for heavy metals. And there are ways to actually do provocation tests through the urine to really see that load. If you live in the farming belt of this country, there's a simple urine test you can do to look for glyphosate levels. And I'm not talking glyphosates are a little high. Sadly, like in this country, you cannot escape glyphosates. Everyone has some glyphosates. Even if you're eating organic, everyone has glyphosates. I'm talking glyphosates are like through the roof, like 99th percentile of glyphosate level. Mold. And sadly, what I find with mold is it doesn't have to be your current home. It could have been a past home that your child grew up in. So if you look back and your child was the kid who was a poor sleeper, right? Never slept well, wired from the moment. That's histamine in an infant. They had gnarly colic. And when you look at what severe colic is, it's not just a gastrointestinal issue. It's a sensory distortion of a child who cannot settle down. Doesn't that sound a lot like ADHD? So we see these things from the very beginning, except we don't equate severe colic to ADHD in a 10-year-old, do we? Except physiologically, they're almost identical, just showing up in a different stage of a human being. So if your child had severe colic, could not be settled, you had to rock them and bounce them like crazy. Later on, they started having weird sensory issues. Your 3-year-old is now having tantrums. You take him into loud and crowded environments. They're freaking out. They don't want their hair washed. They can't wear certain clothing. They're extremely picky in their eating. These are all sensory distortions that are showing their ugly face. Except now we still have yet to recognize that these sensory distortions, which are driven by histamine and microglial activation, are now the building blocks of what is to come with ADHD later on. And I can't tell you how many families in my practice, my general practice, we have the 5-year-old that totally fine. Oh, teacher at school has no concerns for my kid. Except when I sit down with them and we dig, I tell them, like, you realize that all of these things that we're seeing, even though your kindergarten teacher or preschool teacher has no concern, chances are by the time your child is 8 or 10, and now they're in 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 4th grade, that is when your teacher is going to look at you and be like, your kid has ADHD, put him on Ritalin. So part of what I love in my practice is we actually become proactive and preventatively start working to address things. So by the time that child is of older school age, the issues are gone. And that's the beauty of this conversation. All of these things we can take care of. It's not doom and gloom. My kid is doomed. There's nothing to do. All of these things you can take care of once you become aware of them. The other things that start taking place is all of a sudden the child is more anxious. They have social anxiety. Sometimes we see selective mutism, which is just one manifestation of the same thing. And when you don't take care of this, that then starts turning into not just attention deficit hyperactivity or attention deficit disorder. It also starts turning into processing issues. It starts turning into sensory issues. So these children come to think of themselves as socially awkward, socially disconnected, the shy kid, the disconnected kid. And when you look at a lot of these things, the shy kid, the disconnected kid, you ask, why is that child so socially withdrawn? Well, if the entire world is bombarding you, if every day you go into any social setting and that social setting is a battle zone, wouldn't you be kind of withdrawn? And we're so quick to throw a label at this, even in the more natural, holistic world. Oh, that's just a highly sensitive child. And some people are just highly sensitive. Just highly sensitive. I'm highly sensitive. My daughter is highly sensitive. The difference is when you're healthy and highly sensitive, you still perceive a lot that's going on in the world, more than other people, except you're not overwhelmed by it. You're thriving in the world. A highly sensitive person who is healthy should be thriving in the world. A highly sensitive person who's not thriving in the world, who's struggling in the world, who's anxious in the world, is overwhelmed by the world, that's not just highly sensitive. And frankly speaking, these labels that we have given to things have not helped at all, because all we have done is just normalized. Oh, some people just need to leave social settings after half an hour because they just get overwhelmed, and that's just what it is. And I'm not saying that these people are broken, because I'm one of them. And I'll tell you, I've had moments where I've become so overwhelmed that I couldn't be in an environment, and it's not pleasant. And for those of you who are that way, for those of you who have children that way, you realize that it's not a pleasant experience. It's not a joy-filled, happy experience by any means. It's a struggle. It's hard. It's taxing. And why is it hard? Why is it a struggle? Why is it such a problem? Because the system is off. The system is toxic. The system is inflamed. And when we just say, oh, highly sensitive person, except that there's all kinds of odd physiological things that are happening, we haven't done anyone any service. So what do we do about all of this? Here's the first thing you can do. Just stand back and say, is this applicable to me? Is it applicable to my child? Is it applicable to some other person I know? And just stand back and just look at that for a second. And sadly, for those of you whose kids are in this boat, or spouse or yourself are in this boat, you will come to relate to a heck of a lot of these things that I'm sharing with you. And it's not just I'm pulling these things out of thin air. Like, I've experienced it myself. I've seen it in, 1,000, 2,000 kids. What else can you do? If your child is eating a whole lot of processed foods and garbage like Skittles, so food coloring, sugar, preservatives, chemicals, first of all bets are off until those things are taken care of. Sugar, processed foods, food colorings, heavy amounts of various chemicals, food dyes. In these kids, in this specific population of children, if those things are there with large amounts of gluten and dairy and sugar, the likelihood of you being able to slow down this cascade of events, it's like a avalanche coming down the mountain, and you're trying to use a bulldozer to stop it. It's not going to work. That's where I'd say Ritalin and Adderall are the best choice. So why do these things cause such a problem in this population? So imagine your border is completely destroyed, and you have introduced the worst of the worst gangs and awful people you can possibly imagine, like gun-toting, bomb-carrying people. Mast cells, in particular, and you're welcome to look this up. You don't have to believe me. Mast cells, in particular, are highly sensitive to food colorings, to various preservatives, and various other chemicals and compounds. And gluten and dairy happen to be kind of second in line. So when you have a gastrointestinal tract that's lost integrity, and then the bacteria are off and everything else are off, and now there's all of these chemicals being bombarded and thrown into the gut, these mast cells that are already pretty pissed off now become even more reactive, because they perceive all of these chemicals and foods as basically threats. So now you get further immune activation, which further heightens the entire response that then causes an issue here. The more inflammation you have in your gut, the worse you get a leaky gut, because now essentially the soldiers are bombing this barrier to try to protect the body, except all that bombing and attack on the barrier causes more leaky gut, So you get more leaky gut from the inflammation, which is trying to control whatever compound or issue or inflammatory thing is coming in. There's more toxins coming through, and you get this vicious cycle that has no end. The other thing you can do, presuming you can control at least the food colorings, the food preservatives, the sugars, and ideally dial down gluten and dairy, that's not always possible for everyone, is do a simple course of some anti-inflammatories. And this is just for educational purposes. Do not take this random guy who's posting a video as God and talk to your provider before doing this. So with that said, there are two supplements that I've come to love, and I'll give you a few others. Mirica, M-I-R-I-C-A, their standard original formula. It turns out that Deborah Young, who founded Mirica, she ended up having a lot of pain, and I've come to know her really well, and I have no affiliation with them. I'm not making $1 for saying this. Turns out that she created Mirica because she was having a lot of inflammation in her body. And the PEA and luteolin that's in Mirica happens to be really great at calming down the mast cells within the gut. And you can look up PEA mast cells, luteolin mast cells, calms down the mast cells in the gut. The other thing that it's really good at is chilling out the microglia in the brain, which are then causing the impulsivity and some of the anger and aggression and irritability. The other thing that's helpful is a product called Histamine Digest by Seeking Health. And there's other companies that make it. Again, no affiliation with Seeking Health, not $1 for saying this. When you combine those two, so Histamine Digest breaks down histamine, reduces histamine levels in the gut, which then reduces the sensory challenges that you have. And then the Miracle calms down the mast cells in the microglia in the brain. Usually these two supplements given over 3 to 4 weeks. It's not you give it once and voila, miracles happen. And they're capsules. You can mix it up in applesauce, juice, coconut water, whatever. You do that for about 3 or 4 weeks. If your child's ADHD and sensory issues and hyperactivity and irritability calm down by, don't expect a miracle, but by like 30-40%. And depending on the food, depending on the environment, depending on if you're living in mold, sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. It could be as little as 10 to 20%. So if you're living in active mold and your child's immune system is constantly getting activated, these supplements are only going to work so well. Sometimes for kids who have a lot of aggression, a lot of irritability, there are these things called specialized pro-resolving mediators, SPMs. And basically these are fish oil extracts that are also anti-inflammatory. And there's SPM Supreme, the SPM Active by different companies. You basically squeeze out the content and mix it up with everything else, and that further reduces the inflammatory response. By doing these supplements and doing them for a little while, because again, it does take time. It takes several weeks for it to kick in. About a month out, not just have you treated, what you can also do is use this really simple regimen to ask one question. Is inflammation and immune activity a part of my ADHD or my child's ADHD? General dosing, again, talk to a provider. Do not just follow this random video because this is all education, right? Do not take this as God's word. General dosing between 3 to 6 years of age, 1/2 to 1 capsule. 6 to 12 years of age, 1 to 2 capsules. Over 12 years, follow what's on the bottle. The other thing that you may wish to do is to consider mold. So if you live in a home that's a little musty smelling, you've had a little leak, don't expect your ceiling to be falling down because it's almost never the case. There's a simple test you can do called the dust test. I have no affiliation with them either. I love these guys. I love what they're up to. The dust test. And why I love it is it's the first home test you can do that's actually standardized. You get instructions on how to collect the specimen. You send in the specimen. They actually give you information on what to make of it. And if your home comes back at a level 4 or 5, there's a possibility, well, level 5 is high probability you have mold. Level 4, probably you have mold. The sad thing about mold is you don't have to have active mold to have issues related to it. Example, you lived in a home for the first 3 years of your child's life, which is when they had the colic, the irritability, wouldn't sleep, ear infections, all kinds of congestion, allergies, etc., tonsillar hypertrophy, adenoid hypertrophy, all of that could be mold. I'm not saying it's always mold, but it could be a heavy indicator of mold. And then you move out of the house, right? And now you're in home 2. Or your kid was fine until they started daycare. And that is when all of a sudden, or preschool or whatever, all of a sudden everything started. I've seen daycares have mold. I've seen preschools have mold. I've seen middle schools, high schools have mold. There's actually an article that I think I kind of set things off for, where there was actually a heavy concentration of pans and pandas, which also happens to be part of the same process in a different way. So a lot of these poor kids were having intense anxiety, all kinds of other things. Ended up finding mold in a few of the kids. And then the parents from there started digging. And I didn't tell them it was the school. I just said, hey, your kid has been exposed to mold. I have no idea where the heck it's coming from. They're the ones that then went searching and looking and kind of pieced the rest of this together. And why I'm sharing all of this is we still live in a world where our mental health concepts are from 40 years ago, 30 years ago. And science is advanced at such a breakneck speed, and yet we have yet to catch up with that. And why I'm sharing this is I hope many of you who have kids with attention problems, learning disabilities, focus problems, inattention, etc., and as you watch this video, you're like, holy cow, this is my kid. That this empowers you to work with your provider to look at things from a different angle. And for you just to even ask this question of, could this be my kid? Could this be me? And by asking these questions and taking these simple steps, just doing some investigation, some basic testing that you can do with the help of a provider or by yourself, trying a handful of supplements that are very benign. And nothing is risk-free, but relative risk profile is low. By doing these things, if you can get information that then helps your child, and it's not just symptomatic care. The cool thing is when you really get into healing the gut, which is what I do for my families. And sadly, that's not something that's just like, oh, do these 2 things and your gut will be better forever. But when we do the heavy gut protocols, where we really rehab the entire gastrointestinal tract, the beautiful thing is the child who had learning disabilities, the child who had severe ADHD, the child who was basically calling themselves the D word or the S word, that was about to fail out of school, suddenly becomes the brilliant child who's just destroying it. And I've had countless children who are about to fail out of school, who literally couldn't focus for the life of them, who literally could not process. Some of the families had tried multiple different medications, Ritalin, Adderall, Strattera, Concerta, etc. None of them worked. Why didn't these things work? Because it's not a dopamine deficiency. And sometimes the stimulants could be really helpful, and sometimes they're a game changer. But other times, parents are like, what the hell is going on? Like, my kid is still having all of the challenges, and now they can't sleep or eat. But by doing this work, in looking at things in this way, the most important thing is we're able to change that child's life for the rest of their life. We're able to allow their true intelligence to shine through. Because for those of you who are watching this video and you're worried about your kid, what you're seeing in your kid is not your kid. What you're seeing in your kid is your kid who has sludge in their brain and inflammation in their brain. And they're trying to learn and focus and process with sludge and inflammation in their brain. They have the COVID brain that's there all the time for them. And we're expecting them to learn and focus and process with the COVID inflamed brain, except it's not COVID. We can change this. We can heal this. We can address this. And I've seen this in hundreds, if not thousands of kids. This is not like one kid. But this healing starts with conversations and awareness. And I'm grateful that you are all taking the time to watch these videos. I hope you share these with others. If you know of families whose kids are struggling, share this with them. Because that's how we change the world. We bring awareness and we bring information, and we have families and parents say, whoa, that's my kid. And there's a lot more that can be done. And I wish that I could record a 5-hour video to talk about everything else. And my intention is to share more in the future. And part of what I have done is started a free mentorship for providers that are interested. Because I realized that one of the ways we need to change things is by having a whole lot more providers that are understanding this. And for any of you that ultimately want to work with any of these providers, go to Holistic Minds and sign up or join the waitlist as a family. And as soon as these providers have the ability and capacity, we'll be happy to connect you with them. But start with sharing these videos and helping me get the word out, because we need to change this mindset around things like ADHD. So thank you for taking the time to watch this. You all be well. This is Dr. K.